As weeks passed, the whispers grew. Not only were her physicians alarmed, so too were those around her. How closely did Elizabeth I walk with death? How much of her decline was natural illness, and how much the consequence of her own actions? Was the steady march of time finally catching up with her? Or were there other forces at play? Darker things lurking in the recesses of the aging monarch's mind. What disturbed her so deeply that she forsook food and sleep, preferring instead to wander the cold halls of her palace like a specter? And what of those shadowy figures she spoke to? Were they figments of an addled brain or harbingers of her own mortality? As Elizabeth declined, rumors abounded. A Spanish plot, perhaps, poisoning her, exacting revenge on behalf of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, or striking retribution for England's role in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. But as her end drew near, it became clear that no conspiracy, no foreign hand was at work here. Elizabeth was being undone, not by enemies, but by the encroaching darkness within her own heart and mind. In her final moments, she clung to the world of the living by the slimmest of threads. Once her voice faded into silence, and her body turned still in the cold March of 1603. Courtiers rushed forward, desperate to catch a last glimpse of their fading monarch. Some saw only an emaciated shell, others saw a monarch at peace. Did Elizabeth find solace in death? Or was she, as some believed, so frightened of the unknown that even in the final moments of life, she retreated into herself, preferring the company of phantoms to the warmth of the living? When her physicians finally declared her dead, there was a strange hush that fell over the court. The queen was gone, but who was she in those final days? A victim of her past, a prisoner of her memories, or something more, something they could not understand? As they prepared her body for burial, they found that she had passed away wearing her coronation gown. On her head was a nightcap instead of a crown. Oh, and tucked beside her was a picture of her beloved Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. What had haunted her for the last year and a half, what had driven her to the brink of death, had become her final companions. When the news reached Scotland, James VI was proclaimed king. Soon as he would enter England in triumph, taking his place on the throne that was both his birthright and Elizabeth's. What would he find in the palace when he arrived? The ghost of a queen, a shadow of a monarch, a reminder of the fragility of power and the frailty of humanity. What had seemed invincible, what had shone so brightly, now looked only wan and withered. And as we close this chilling tale, we are left to ponder the final days of the Virgin Queen. Was this the inevitable decline of a long-reigning monarch, a victim of her own immortality? Was this the price Elizabeth paid for defying death for so long? Or was she paying for the lives she had taken to preserve her power? Elizabeth I, once the radiant, commanding Queen of England, died not in glory, but in eerie decline. Her demise was not a swift retreat, but a haunting spiral into the shadows of her own past. A chilling reminder that even the brightest flames burn out, and even the mightiest empires crumble to dust. Elizabeth, once hailed as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the lioness who defied popes and monarchs who reigned over a golden age of English culture and power, ended her life not in glory, but in eerie decline. But this is not the story you'll find in polished history books or classroom retellings. This is a tale of unraveling, of a mind slowly giving way to shadows, of a monarch consumed not by illness alone, but by her own ghosts. And as we peel back the elegant courtly veneers, we begin to see a woman no longer in command, but tormented by what she could not control: age, death, and memory. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Did you know that? So, your palm is showing. You gotta be quicker than that. Alright, your move. Dang it. Alright, let's go. Elizabeth's court had learned to fear silence, but now it was all that remained. Ministers crept like shadows through the halls, careful not to disturb the thick stillness that surrounded her. No one knew what to say anymore, and even those who had once basked in the warmth of her favor, now spoke in hushed tones. Not from respect, but out of deep, shivering unease. The queen was no longer a ruler of presence and command. She was becoming a relic of something once divine, now decaying. Her long refusal to name a successor bred more tension with each passing hour. Her counselors, Cecil, Howard, and others, were torn between duty and fear, between preserving the dignity of their queen and preparing for the inevitable collapse of her reign. Yet still, Elizabeth refused to lie down. For 6 full days and nights, she stood, her thin legs trembling beneath layers of velvet and bone, refusing the bed that seemed to beckon her like a grave. Her ladies-in-waiting tried to persuade her, even begged her, tears in their eyes, voices trembling, but she pushed them away with a stare that pierced like frost. "Lust is not a word to be used to princes," she once said in her youth, and now, in the hour of death, she lived by it more fiercely than ever. But her body, the once commanding vessel of a nation's power, could not obey her will forever. Her feet swelled, her fingers shook, her heart beat with a regular rhythm, too slow one moment, too fast the next. Her lips cracked beneath the weight of white lead, and beneath her eyes bloomed the deep purple shadows of insomnia and despair. Still she stood, till she couldn't. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she collapsed silently into the arms of a servant. No scream, no cry, just surrender. They carried her, finally, to the bed she had refused, laying her down upon stiff royal sheets as though placing a relic inside a coffin. Her eyes remained open, but they did not see. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. It was as if her soul hovered at the edge of her body, not willing to leave yet, not certain what waited beyond. Outside, the court trembled. England had known only her for 44 years. Entire generations had never known another ruler. To imagine a world without Elizabeth was to imagine the end of order itself. Some believed her death would spark civil war, that rivals for the throne would rise and tear the country apart. Others whispered that her death was a punishment, a final reckoning for the blood spilled during her long and turbulent reign. At corners of the palace, priests murmured prayers over candles that sputtered and dimmed in the March winds. And still, the queen lingered. They said she refused all food and drink, that her throat was parched, her stomach empty, yet she pushed away every offering with a twitch of her hand or a shake of her fading head. Physicians tried poultices, concoctions, even ancient remedies involving crushed pearls and rose oil, but nothing touched her decline. Her mind was no longer in the room. She had drifted somewhere between worlds. Some nights she moaned softly, words lost in breath, syllables warped beyond meaning. One lady swore she heard her whisper, "I am the shadow I feared," though no one else confirmed it. Another claimed she spoke Latin in a fevered trance, cursing and absolving her soul in the same breath. But whether these were truth or tales, one fact remained: certain Elizabeth was not dying peacefully. She was struggling, as if dragged into death by unseen hands. And around her, those same shadows she once commanded began to consume the palace. Curtains were drawn tighter, candles burned lower. The courtiers, dressed in darker clothes, preparing not only for mourning, but for power shifts that would follow her last breath. Every footstep was muffled, every look held suspicion. Cases traveled in secret to Scotland, where James waited for confirmation of the inevitable. But none could bring themselves to speak it aloud. In the palace, Elizabeth was dying, and in her dying, a chapter of English history was collapsing. On the 6th night, as her breathing grew shallower, her ladies brought in her old ring, symbol of her queenship, of her promise to remain married to her people alone. They slipped it onto her thin, bony finger. It nearly fell off. The once glorious ring that gleamed in the sunlit courts of her prime now looked absurd against the corpse-like pallor of her hand. She did not react. Her eyes, sunken deep beneath waxy skin, flickered once toward the ceiling, and then shut. A hush fell across the room. No one knew if she had gone. Then her chest rose against low, painful, forced, not yet. The playwright who wrote the first draft of this scene was thinking of the famous line from Shakespeare's Richard III. My bowels, my limbs, my very doors are tombs. And he placed it in the mouth of Elizabeth's old servant, Bridget. Here's the relevant excerpt. Bridget, my bowels, my limbs, my very doors are tombs, wherein is stuffed the breath of life. Oh, cruel death! Art thou not ashamed? The line echoes the Queen's ghostly appearance in the play Richard III, where she utters the famous line, Why art thou come so soon? In the original script, her ghost appears in a tomb-like structure surrounded by banners emblazoned with her name. Her specter delivers a prophecy about the downfall of Richard, the rightful heir to the throne, and then disappears. When news of Elizabeth's illness first reached London, there was a morbid fascination in the air. Her symptoms were the stuff of legend: fever, shivering, sweating, and then the spots, those vile, disfiguring blotches that bespoke both plague and poison. Her doctors, baffled and bound by duty, did their best to stem the tide of infection that racked her frame. One noted the Queen's tongue was much furred. Another observed how fast she wasted away. Within weeks, her physicians lost track of time. There were better things to attend to than hours or days. Elizabeth herself seemed to lose track as well. What mattered was the task at hand, staving off death, holding on to power. Until the end, she summoned counsel, wrote letters, even dictated speeches. Then, as the fever spiked, her thoughts drifted away from governance to ghosts. More and more, she spoke to people who were not there. Sometimes they were her parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Sometimes they were her sister, Mary Tudor, whom she had outlived by 8 years. Once it was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and a rumored former suitor, whose ghost, she claimed, was at her bedside. Those who heard this walked away unsettled. Who could make sense of a fever dream? And yet, they couldn't help wondering, were those phantoms real? Or was Elizabeth seeing things no one else could? The answer, as answers go, is rarely simple. That Elizabeth's inner turmoil was mirrored in the outer turmoil of the kingdom. News of her sickness spurred rumors of a plot to kill her, of a hidden heir, of a kingdom ripe to be seized. Though no one dared approach her person, fear wormed its way into the very stones of the palace. People close to Elizabeth found themselves locked out. Her personal servants were abruptly dismissed. New faces, younger faces, appeared at her bedside. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was closer to 6 months, Elizabeth rallied. She dressed in elaborate garments, appearing in public to show she was well enough to receive ambassadors and dictate policy. But those appearances hid a deeper truth. She never really recovered from the bout of smallpox. She would never rule as she had before. Instead, a phantom queen took her place. No one knew it at the time, but Elizabeth I was dead. Long live the Queen. That was the cry when her body lay in state inside Westminster Hall. It was a spectacle of death meant to glorify a life and reassure a kingdom. But for many who crowded into the space to pay their respects, it was also a moment of reckoning. What they saw was not the legendary Elizabeth, but a waxwork rendered in her likeness, preserved in a glass case. They came to mourn a monarch, but they found something far more potent, something far more terrible. They called her the Virgin Queen, but in death, Elizabeth I became something more. Who are you, Elizabeth? You ask this question as you stand before her tomb, right? For centuries, pilgrims have come to this place to pay their respects to England's most famous monarch. But who was she really? Who was this extraordinary woman whose life spanned a turbulent 70 years and whose death inspired some of the earliest modern horror stories? Was she a god, a monster, or something else entirely? As you make your way through the hallowed halls of Westminster Abbey, you'll encounter the many guises she inhabited throughout her life. The Virgin Queen, for instance, forever evading the shackles of marriage and the expectations of her time. The ruthless monarch who presided over the deaths of 2 husbands, 5 of her council members, and possibly up to 300 people in total. The warrior queen who vanquished the Spanish Armada and secured England's place as a global power. The doting sister who wrote loving letters to Princess Margaret and doted on her niece's children. Yes, she may have been born into the royal family, but she was also an individual with hopes, dreams, fears, and flaws. And yet somehow, the sum of these parts remains shrouded in mystery. That's because, as you walk among the artifacts of her life, the regal finery, and intimate mementos, you realize that she crafted an elaborate series of facades that continue to influence our perception of her today. For example, the regal portraits adorning these very abbey walls present a carefully constructed image of the Virgin Queen. They emphasize her otherness, her otherworldly beauty, and suggest a certain aloofness, a distance from the messy realities of human existence. But beyond these curated images, who did Elizabeth I truly resemble? Well, if we're honest, probably no one. The problem with trying to capture her likeness is that she was constantly reinventing herself. So the only accurate portrait of her is this one, a self-made icon whose features seem almost alien to us now. What does it mean for an image to be timeless? And how does that relate to our perception of history? Is Elizabeth I's death haunting us even now because it forces us to confront the unsettling truth about the nature of time and memory? We can see this haunting everywhere, from the chilling legends that sprang up in the weeks following her death to the lurid tales published in the sensationalist press of the 19th century. Each retelling morphs and magnifies the mystery surrounding her demise. But what if these stories aren't just entertaining Gothic fiction? What if they hold a deeper, more unsettling truth about the way our memories distort and amplify the past? For instance, in Victorian broadsheets, Elizabeth's ghost wasn't just a story to scare children. It was a commentary on the state of the nation, a reminder of the glories of the past, and a warning about the dangers of the present. When Elizabeth died, the country she'd known for 7 decades was gone. England was on the brink of change, and the uncertainty was terrifying. The familiar landmarks of her era, including the palace where she spent her final years, had vanished, destroyed in a fire that swept through Whitehall in 1698. All that remained were the foundations and the memories. And so the ghost stories emerged as a way to fill the void left by her passing. They allowed her subjects to confront the new world without losing touch with the past. But that doesn't explain why she appears as a ghost at all. Well, think about it this way. Elizabeth was seen as a living goddess during her lifetime. She was celebrated as invincible, untouchable, a figure who transcended the limitations of mere mortals. But when she died, that image shattered, revealing the frail, flawed human being underneath. So the ghost stories became a way to reconcile that dissonance, to imagine her as a spirit wandering the halls of her former home. They allowed her subjects to view her as both fully human and eternally removed from them, a paradoxical image that persists in contemporary culture, too. Today, we remember her as a flawless icon, the epitome of feminine wiles and masculine strength. We celebrate her resilience and independence while simultaneously mourning the personal sacrifices she made in pursuit of her ideals. In literature and film, she's often portrayed as an ethereal, even mystical figure. Think of the otherworldly Elizabeth in the BBC's White Queen, or the spectral version in the film Elizabeth. These portrayals resonate because they tap into our fascination with the uncanny valley, our tendency to find things that are almost human more unsettling than those that are clearly artificial. So as you stand here contemplating the mysteries of her death and the myths that surround it, remember that Elizabeth's true legacy lies not in her bloodline or her battles, but in the stories we tell about her. After all, it's not the bricks and mortar of palaces or the weight of crowns that make her so haunting. It's the stories we tell about her, stories that shape our understanding of who she was and who we want her to be. Because in the end, Elizabeth's death, like all deaths, was a deeply human event. And it's precisely that rawness, that vulnerability, that makes her so enduring. Despite her best efforts to craft a flawless image, to present a face of regal composure and stoic indifference, she ultimately succumbed to the same ailments that afflict us all. As you gaze upon her tomb, let this be your final lesson. Remember that behind the legends and myths, there existed a real woman, wrestling with real emotions, grappling with the same fears and frailties that define our shared humanity. In that realization, perhaps we find the most profound connection to the woman who reigned over England so long ago. The weeks following Elizabeth's burial were not marked by peace, but by a persistent disquiet that no proclamation from the new king could silence. The people of England had not simply lost a monarch, they had lost a symbol, a presence, a force that for nearly half a century had defined the rhythm of the realm. And in the void she left behind, rumors grew like mold on damp stone. Even among those who had never seen her in life, her absence was palpable. In marketplaces, in chapels, in alleyways, the same questions circled in low tones. Had she died well? Had she repented? Was she truly at rest? Those closest to her knew the answers were far more disturbing. For they had seen the mask slip, the image of Elizabeth, the eternal crown, poised. Serene had been a fragile illusion in her final weeks, barely held together by powder and performance. What remained beneath that veneer was not the mighty lioness of England, but a withered woman, trembling in the dark, too afraid to close her eyes, too proud to show weakness, and too haunted to find sleep. She had spent her life mastering image, wielding symbolism like a weapon, and yet, when the end came, none of it could shield her from the terrible intimacy of death. The courtiers, who had once basked in her attention, now spoke only in cautious tones about her final days. They rarely used her name, as though it might still summon her. In secret journals and coded letters, they hinted at what they had witnessed: the sleepless pacing, the vacant stares, the whispered names of the dead. Some feared that if these truths were made public, it would tarnish the very fabric of English glory. Others believed that by revealing her final decline, they could finally reclaim their own humanity from beneath the weight of her long shadow. But none could deny what they had seen. One servant confessed years later that he would often wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, hearing her voice calling from behind closed doors, begging to be left alone, weeping like a child. Another claimed he had once passed her chamber and found her crouched in the corner, murmuring to a spot on the wall, tears streaking her white-painted face, her crown resting beside her on the floor like an abandoned relic. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, became part of the oral folklore surrounding Gloriana's end. It wasn't just death that haunted the palace, it was the spectacle of a monarch losing control. Its belief in divine right, in majesty without flaw. This image was more terrifying than any battlefield or plague. It suggested that power could corrode from within, that the same force which had lifted her above others had slowly hollowed her out until only performance remained. And when even that failed her, what was left was not a queen, but a frightened woman in a darkened room. The priests, who had been summoned to perform the final rites, spoke of a kind of spiritual resistance. Elizabeth, they said, would not receive communion, would not utter the prayers, would not allow the usual rituals of passage. Whether out of pride, fear, or confusion, she rejected the sacraments with the same stubbornness with which she had once rejected suitors and advisers. It was as though she intended to defy even God, or at least negotiate with him on her own terms. But to the clergy, this was not strength, it was spiritual peril. Some whispered that her soul was now restless, caught between this world and the next, neither damned nor saved, forever circling the place where her body had fallen. Meanwhile, James I settled into his throne with increasing discomfort. The shadow of Elizabeth loomed over every ceremony, every decree, every royal visit. He had inherited the crown, but not the reverence. Wherever he went, portraits of the Virgin Queen remained, their eyes seeming to judge him from the canvas, cold and eternal. He ordered some removed, replaced others with his own image, but the people did not forget. In fact, they clung to her memory more fiercely in her absence, casting her as the golden standard by which all others would be measured and found wanting. And so, Elizabeth's afterlife began not in heaven or hell, but in the collective psyche of a people who both revered and feared her. She became a kind of mythological creature, both divine and monstrous, a woman who had ruled with brilliance and brutality, who had loved no one, and yet belonged to everyone, who had built an empire and died whispering to ghosts. Her story could not be tidied into a neat ending. It lingered, like the echo of footsteps down an empty hall. It bled through tapestries and court records, through paintings and plays, through the stones of the very palaces she once commanded. And in that lingering presence lay her truest power, not in the battles she won or the treaties she signed, but in the terror she left behind, the terror of a legacy that refused to fade, the terror of a woman who had become something more than human and something far more frightening. And now for our main event, a tale of terror from the Tudor court. Let me introduce our intrepid reporter, who will guide us through the eerie events surrounding the death of one of history's most iconic monarchs. Elizabeth had died on March 1603. Time marched forward, but the air around her legacy never cleared. Even years after her body had turned to dust, the silence she left behind continued to speak in tremors, shaping the psychology of every monarch who came after. James, I ruled with intellect, yes, but also with a quiet and constant anxiety as if he feared that the moment he relaxed his grip, her ghost would return to reclaim what he had borrowed. In staterooms and private chambers, her name was spoken with caution. Her symbols, gloves, pearls, the Tudor rose were still visible, carved into the architecture, woven into the cloth of banners, embedded in the ceremonial rituals of the crown. And yet no one dared speak of her death directly. It was a wound covered by velvet, a secret embalmed in stone. At Richmond Palace, where she had spent her last conscious days, servants still avoided the upper chambers. They claimed that on certain nights, especially in late March, sound of pacing footsteps echoed above the ceiling beams. Long, slow, measured, as if someone were still refusing to rest. Doors that had been locked were found slightly ajar. Candles, freshly snuffed, would relight themselves with no breeze in the room. One maid reported seeing a woman in white staring out the window of the Queen's former chamber, her posture eerily still, her face lost to shadow. But when others investigated, the room was empty except for the faint smell of lavender, Elizabeth's favorite perfume. And still, her memory was not treated with tenderness. It was revered, yes, but not with warmth, not with comfort. Elizabeth was no saint. She had ordered executions with a flick of her hand. She had imprisoned her cousin Mary and signed her death warrant without flinching. She had used love as a weapon, trust as bait, and silence as a blade. Her courtiers never truly knew her. They loved her with terror. They obeyed her with devotion born not of affection, but awe. Even her most trusted advisers, Burleigh, Walsingham, had learned to walk carefully in her presence, never sure which side of the Queen they would meet. In death, this caution persisted. No monument, no poem, no royal decree dared diminish her, because to do so felt dangerous, as if her very name still carried the power to curse. But while Elizabeth's death cast a long shadow over England's monarchy, it also seeded a darker truth in the collective soul of her people, the realization that glory was temporary, and power could be beautiful and horrifying in the same breath. For the common folk, her reign had often felt distant, her decisions made behind curtains of velvet and steel. Yet, in her decline, she became strangely relatable, mortal, vulnerable, and in that, Tej, there was a grim comfort. Even Gloriana could fall. Tej, then perhaps suffering was not a punishment, but a condition shared by all. Writers and playwrights of the era began weaving her image into their work, sometimes in open tribute, other times as a veiled commentary. Her downfall was used to explore the limits of power, the madness of isolation, the consequence of believing oneself chosen by divine right. And while the official chronicles praised her to the heavens, the underground stories told a more haunting tale of queen who had ruled alone, loved no one, trusted few, and in the end, died surrounded by people she could not reach. Some versions of the story became darker still. Whispers emerged that she had seen visions in her final hours, not of saints, but of the condemned, that she cried out not for salvation, but for forgiveness from the shadows that crowded her chamber, that her last word was not a prayer, but a name, perhaps Essex, perhaps Dudley, perhaps someone unknown to history, that her ring, that sacred emblem of her marriage to the nation, had grown so loose on her finger that it fell off before burial, as though the union had finally dissolved. None of this could be confirmed, but none of it could be denied either. And so Elizabeth became a ghost of contradictions, a sovereign of strength and solitude, a woman whose greatest weapon had always been control, undone in the end by the one force she could not command. And this is perhaps what makes her death so terrifying in the darkness of the room. Not the silence of her courtiers, not the refusal to eat or sleep, but the realization that she saw it coming, that she knew that for all her intelligence, her foresight, her ruthless calculation, she could not outwit the shadow waiting at the edge of her bed. And so she stood, for hours, for days, refusing to lay down. Not because she believed she could avoid death, but because standing was the only act of defiance left to her. And even now, in the quiet corners of English history, you can feel her presence, not in the grandeur of her achievements, but in the quiet horror of her end, in the sound of a door closing softly, in the flicker of a candle in an empty room, in the cold stone beneath a royal tomb that still draws curious eyes and hushed voices. Elizabeth, I may have died centuries ago, but her final days, her final resistance, her final fear, continue to echo. You've probably heard of her, the Virgin Queen, the great monarch who beat back the Spanish Armada, who ushered in an age of English greatness, who never married so that she could rule untethered to a king's favor. But what came before the legend? What was life like inside the court of Elizabeth I? And how did her closest advisors survive her gaze? Hi, and welcome to this house. Welcome to this house. Today, we are exploring the palaces and privy gardens of Elizabeth I, a monarch whose life was an open book to the public, but whose private spaces remained shrouded in mystery. Make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Elizabeth's court had always revolved around her gravity. Every gesture, every silence, every smile or frown from the queen could shift alliances, end careers, ignite scandals. Once she was gone, once the velvet cushions no longer bore her weight, the machinery she had held together with sheer will began to creak. The nobles, who once trembled before her gaze, found themselves adrift in a new era where her iron presence no longer dictated the rhythm of the court. And still, no one could speak openly of her end. It was too raw, too strange, too terrifying. They spoke of her brilliance, of Tilbury, of Gloriana, of the Virgin Queen who defied empires. But behind closed doors, in the moments between ceremony and sleep, the true memory haunted them. The memory of her pacing the cold floors, her lips cracked, eyes wide and distant. The days she spent standing, unwashed, whispering to no one. The way the palace smelled of decay and lavender. Her final moments had not been regal. They had been human. It's painfully, disturbingly human. James, I ordered no grand statues to be erected in her honor. Some said he feared her memory might overshadow his reign. Others believed he simply didn't understand what she'd have been to England. She had been more than monarchs. She had been a presence, a phantom stitched into the very fabric of the nation. And now, with her gone, the court moved like a body missing its head. Uncertain and cautious, fearing the empty air where her voice used to echo. Even the architecture seemed to remember her. The throne she once occupied felt colder, somehow. The corridors she haunted grew quieter. Her bedchambers remained sealed for weeks, as if opening them too soon might let something unholy slip out. When they finally dared to enter, they found her belongings untouched, gloves still laid upon the table. A mirror turned inward, as if it too could no longer bear to reflect the woman who once gazed into it. Her final garments, stained with sweat and age, were carefully catalogued, but no one dared dispose of them. They remained locked away, sacred and terrible relics of a queen who had become something between saint and specter. Some servants refused to return to Richmond at all. One footman claimed he heard her voice humming through the rafters, the same lullaby she'd been known to murmur in the hours before dawn. Another said he'd seen a pale hand reach through the curtain in the chapel, even though no one was inside. These stories were dismissed by the new court, but not forgotten, 'cause the truth, even when hidden beneath protocol and prayer, does not die with the body. It lingers, unsettled, just like the soul they feared had never found rest. In the countryside, commoners began to fashion charms bearing her initials, believing that Elizabeth's spirit still had power to ward off evil. Mothers whispered her name over their babies at night. Soldiers kept portraits of her in their packs. Her legend bled into magic, into folklore, into something both feared and revered. And yet, even this reverence was laced with dread, because no one could shake the final image of a queen refusing comfort, staring into nothing, dragging her body toward a death she had foreseen but could not soften. Historians would argue for centuries about what truly happened in those final days. Was it madness? Was it guilt? Was it the unraveling of a life lived too long in isolation and control? Or had she seen something beyond the veils, something that pulled her from rest and sleep? Caries rose like smoke, thick and endless. But the one truth that no one could escape was this: Elizabeth did not die quietly. She did not go gently. Her death was not peaceful. It was a storm breaking within stone walls, a slow and terrifying surrender. And perhaps that is what makes her story endure. Not the power, not the speeches, not the golden age that bore her name, but the image of a monarch facing her end without armor. Because in those final days, Elizabeth I became what she had never allowed herself to be in life: vulnerable, unprotected, alone. And yet, even then, she did not scream. She did not beg. She did not plead. She simply stood, stared, and waited. What she saw in those last hours, no one will ever know. Whether it was the faces of the condemned or the ghosts of the lovers she had lost. Whether it was the reckoning of a soul burdened by too many secrets, or perhaps she saw nothing at all. Perhaps the terror was in the silence, in the realization that, after everything, she would pass like anyone else into darkness, unnamed, untouched. But the world did not forget, and the darkness she entered was not complete. For even now, in hushed tones, in stone halls, in the flickering corners of forgotten rooms, her story is still told, not in light, but in shadow. This is a new episode. Till today, we are discussing the myths and legends surrounding the death of Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch. And, a quick reminder, this is a space where we explore the darker aspects of history. We talk about death, disease, and sometimes graphic violence. Viewer discretion is advised. A 1603, the court moved on, because it had to. James held his coronation with measured pomp, the banners raised, the trumpets echoing through Westminster, but no ceremony could erase what the palace still remembered. Even in celebration, her shadow persisted, like a figure just beyond the curtains, watching silently as history bent itself into new shapes. The tapestries were replaced, the portraits rehung, but those who had stood in Elizabeth's presence knew that something vital had been lost, something no new monarch could replicate. James ruled, yes, but he did not haunt, and haunting, it seemed, had been Elizabeth's truest power. The fear she once instilled had not died, it had transmuted. It became awe, then myth, then unease. Even after her burial, rumors flourished that her death had not been natural, that perhaps she had chosen to die at that precise moment as a final act of control, that perhaps she had willed her own end rather than allow the humiliation of weakness to persist one day longer. Some claimed she had summoned astrologers in her final nights, seeking a celestial time to vanish. Others believed her decline had been orchestrated by those who wanted her gone. Whispers of poison, of betrayal, of curses left unsaid. None of it could be proven. All of it lingered. But the most disturbing stories came from those who had attended her bedside. Those few allowed to see the Queen without her mask. One maid confessed, years later, that Elizabeth had spoken to her as if she were someone else entirely, calling her by the name of a long-dead sister, gripping her wrists so tightly that bruises bloomed. A gentleman of the Privy Chamber reported that in her final hours she stared past him, wide-eyed, and whispered, "He is here now." When asked who, she would not respond. Only silence, only stillness, and then the trembling. Whether these were hallucinations or true visitations, no one could say. But they became part of the legend, part of the legacy. For Elizabeth's story could never simply end, not cleanly, not peacefully. She had spent a lifetime wrapping herself in symbols, in prophecy, in ritual. Her death would be no different. It would carry the same weight, the same ambiguity, the same terror. The poets who later wrote of her death did not describe a gentle passing. They spoke of a soul wrested from the body, a light extinguished not softly, but violently, a monarch dragged into the void by unseen hands. And whether metaphor or memory, those images stuck. They became truth, because the truth was not in documents or records, it was in the fear etched on the faces of those who had been there, the dread they refused to name. And outside the palace, among the people, something strange happened. Elizabeth, once so distant, so untouchable, became familiar in her death. Folk tales grew from the soil of her story. She was said to visit the dreams of widows, to protect young girls from assault, to punish cruel husbands. Her spirit, they claimed, had not left England, but now wandered it more freely, more powerfully than ever before. A queen in life, a force in death. In one small village, mothers began telling their daughters, "Be strong, like the dead queen." In another, it was said that a shrine had been built in secret, a place where women knelt to ask Elizabeth's blessing for courage or revenge. The church, naturally, condemned these practices, but they could not stop them, because the people had seen something in her final days that no doctrine could explain. A monarch who faced the dark without armor, who embraced the terror others fled. Meanwhile, the monarchy struggled to contain her legacy. James wanted peace, not phantoms. Case was elusive when the past refused to stay buried. Elizabeth's funeral mask, made of wax, was stored away in a vault, but servants swore it wept. Crowned, passed on to the new king, was polished and reset with new gems, but still bore the weight of her touch. And every time James entered a hall where she had once ruled, there was a hush, a hesitation, as though the room remembered. Years turned to decades. Lisbeth became a chapter in history, but not a quiet one. Plays were written. Portraits were commissioned. Her legend grew teeth, then wings. She was called the Virgin Queen, the Phoenix Queen, the Last Tudor. But behind every title, every flourish of praise, there lurked the same image of a woman alone, refusing sleep, whispering to shadows, staring into the void. And still, no one could quite explain her final words, if she uttered any at all. Some claimed she uttered a blessing, others a warning. One account, half buried in a private letter, claimed she simply said, "I am not done," and then her eyes closed. No one knows if that account was true, but those 4 words, like a nail in old wood, refused to come loose. I am not done. Not a farewell, not a prayer, but a statement, a promise, or perhaps